Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first M4L Academy Rhetoric for the Republic event. This is where we bring in real people to have real conversations, even if we disagree, on the issues and topics that impact kids, schools, and of course, parental rights. My name is Missy Karwowski, director of M4L Academy, and I'm always glad that you're with us, but I'm particularly excited that you've joined us tonight because I am so passionate about being able to enable conversation to help unify us again. Because at Moms for Liberty, that's one of the things that we strive to do. We strive to build relationships and unify parents. And sometimes that can be a little challenging. I mean, on topics right now, if we look at the United States, it doesn't really feel like we're very united on pretty much any topic across the board, whether it's education or immigration or immunizations. It really is hard to get anyone to agree about basically anything. And well, it may feel that way, at least if you are sitting there doom scrolling on your phone, probably stuck in that echo chamber that was definitely built by AI to keep you angry and still scrolling. But that's why we're doing this tonight, to help empower you with model conversations. Is that's one of the things that I've heard is a frustration and really a fear from many people is they're just not sure how to stand up and say something. They may feel passionate about a topic and want to say something, but don't know what to say for fear of getting attacked or villainized or canceled, even in their own lives. And while it may seem more acceptable now, unfortunately, to call names and shout people down if you don't agree with them, yeah, that gets more clicks and views, but it's not solving any problems. It's definitely not changing perspectives, and it's not helping to unify our country. Again, that is the goal for the Rhetoric events tonight, to help model a conversation and to equip you, the parents, grandparents, and really anybody who understands the true importance of parental rights so that you can take these conversations back home and you can have them in your life as well. So, without further ado, I'm really excited to announce tonight's topic, which is to vax or not to vax, weighing the mandate to protect versus the right to refuse. I'm very excited to introduce our two speakers who are going to be talking tonight. This is a little bit of a unique event because we have some... On this topic, one might think that you need to only have medical experts. That's the only people who are allowed to weigh in on this. There's actually a lot of conversation, I think, right now that if you're not an expert, you really shouldn't be talking about certain things. So I'm particularly excited because these two women, they are experts at modeling good conversation. And that is really, truly what we are trying to do, is help build bridges and have those conversations on these very tough topics and be able to still have a relationship. So I'm particularly excited to have these two today. This is in response, by the way, the topic that we're doing of to vax or not to vax is in response to the AAP's recent policy statement trying to eliminate non-medical exemptions. Now, I understand, we already talked about this. We know that there are some states that already have that. You're already not allowed to have any other non-medical exemptions. However, this is a push to do it really nationwide. So we're gonna talk about that. So my first speaker is Carrie Bigford. Carrie is nearly 25 years ago, after losing a loved one due to vaccine injury, experiencing the abandonment that follows a vaccine injury, and discovering the safety and liability issues inherent in the vaccine program, Carrie made the choice to become a fierce and vocal advocate for medical liberty. Since that decision, Carrie has volunteered for multiple medical liberty organizations in 3 different states, mainly focusing on legislative advocacy and community outreach. As a trained mental health professional with a thriving private practice, Carrie never imagined that she would become a paid advocate, but fate had other plans when inspiration struck for her while volunteering with Texans for Vaccine Choice in 2021. She decided that she would combine her professional knowledge and personal experience as a volunteer advocate to create a complete medical liberty advocate volunteer training program. Texans for Vaccine Choice supported Carrie's efforts and offered her a full-time position as outreach director, and Effective Outreach was launched in January of 2023. The addition of the volunteer training program revolutionized the organization and has enabled them to maintain 100% bad bill kill rate, pass 12 protective pieces of legislation, train nearly 100 volunteers, place active medical liberty advocates all over Texas, and cement status as the most effective state-level medical liberty organization in the country. Well, by golly, you have not done anything at all, have you?
No, I've been very bored.
Yeah, I can tell. He just probably sit around and do nothing. And representing, it's with the organization of Texans for Vaccine Choice, you guys might be able to figure out which side that she is advocating for. And I'm particularly excited as well because I've been starting to work closely with our other speaker who is from the Braver Angels organization. We are united in our goal to help bridge these or create these conversations to bridge the gap, which makes me very excited to have you here representing the other side. So for pro-mandate, basically. And this is Jesse Mannisto is a former CIA leadership analyst, Google Policy Fellow, political activist, and founder and editor emerita of Third Factor, an online magazine, podcast, and membership community dedicated to the search for the higher path. With interests in psychology and philosophy, she was drawn to the Braver Angels debate program as a way to productively channel that intellectual energy that we so often use to process or to cloak our more vulnerable emotions. After getting deeply involved in her local alliance's debate program, she was thrilled to come on board as Braver Angels Director of Debates in 2024. Welcome, ladies. I am so excited to have you both here.
Having us.
Yeah. So I'd like to start out, and the goal here, this sounds a little bit like a debate, but it really is intended to be a conversation. So we'll call it a debate-inspired conversation. And so with that in mind, I'd like you each to lay out sort of the foundations of your perspective that you're representing. So, Carrie, do you want to start?
Yes, I'm representing the perspective of no government mandates. My main basis for that is that currently the vaccine recipient themselves is the sole guarantor of all legal, financial, and physical risk inherent in the vaccination process. And so your only protection against the risk inherent in being a vaccine recipient is your ability to say yes or no, free of coercion. And if we remove that ability to say yes or no, and employ coercion as a mandate is a coercive tool, then that individual no longer has a choice. And they are forced to accept all of the inherent risk as a vaccine recipient, regardless of what that risk entails.
All right. Would you like to put out your perspective?
Thank you. Sure. So let me be perfectly honest. I am not entirely sure what I think about this issue, because let me be the first person to say that if I believed that vaccines were unsafe and the government told me that I had to vaccinate my children, I would be the first person to get put in jail, fight, say absolutely not. So I have a great deal of respect for where Carrie is coming from and for the fact that we need to have this conversation. That being said, I'm here today to represent the pro-mandate view. I am not a medical doctor. Carrie's going to mop the floor with me when it comes to understanding the issue. But what I do,
But I am not a medical doctor either.
And yet you've done your research, as they say. You have a lot of information. I don't. But what I do have is I work as Missy was saying, I work as the director of debates for Braver Angels. So I've heard experts in public health on both sides of this issue, because experts in public health are not united on this. I understand that. But I've heard plenty of people saying, okay, well, how do I even refute this? There's so much misinformation out there. My goodness, like, why don't you trust us? And so for me, the really interesting question is, there's expertise out there, but why are we even having this conversation if that's the case? And so I am here as someone who is humble in the face of something I don't understand, but I trust doctors. Carrie and I were chatting. She has a lot of information. It's counter to what doctors that I trust are telling me. How do I make sense of this? How do you make sense of this? Why are we in this position where we lack trust? And so I will say representing the pro-mandate view, even though what I said about fighting the government if they tried to make me put children in danger, I would have to do that. I also understand the argument is that vaccines are a particular thing. We need herd immunity. If we don't vaccinate, then the people who suffer are people like, the immunocompromised, that sort of thing. We need the herd immunity. I am here thinking both of a woman who came to a debate we did at Braver Angels in February. Resolved, America needs the changes that President Trump and his administration promise. That covers a lot of ground, right? And all of our positions they're not House positions. We take equal speeches in the affirmative and the negative, for and against our resolutions. So just so happened to be this one was framed in the pro-President Trump stance. And a woman stood up to speak in the affirmative. And she had the oxygen tube, right? Yeah. Because she said this came from a vaccine injury. And it was the very first time she had ever felt heard, that anyone cared, that this room full of people who were pro-vaccine wanted to hear what she had to say. And I am here hoping that I will learn something about why people don't trust their doctors. Hey, my doctor's written me off a lot. So I'm starting from that place, like, hey, can you listen to me? Can you listen to what I've dealt with? But the other side, and the side that I am here to advocate for, because there isn't anyone else here to do it, and that speaks to the fact, like, if you're a medical doctor and you disagree with what I'm saying, or you're for this side, come to the next Moms for Liberty event. Come talk to them. We got to be talking across the aisles here. But I am thinking of another friend of mine who had she had twin children, and one of them died of the flu. And she said, if only people around me had vaccinated against the flu, maybe my child would still have been here. And I don't know which of those sides is true. So I'm not going to be able to make the case for the science, but I am going to try to represent what I'm hearing from that other side that, unfortunately, because of the state of our politics, isn't in the room here today. And I'll do the best I can.
Well, thank you for that. And I also wanted to lay out that you're not the only one. So I'm sitting here as moderator, and yes, we did invite a number of people. And unfortunately, nope, they did not. They were very happy to make statements, not on camera, not willing to have the conversation here. So that's fine. I do have some devil's advocate questions that I might ask and pose. So I'm excited to get into it. Now, you brought up a couple of really interesting things right off the bat there. I heard herd immunity. That, to me, I think is probably one of the biggest arguments that I would say is the reason why people insist that we need to get this. So why don't we start with you, Carrie, and you can explain why shouldn't we? Because after all, it is for the public health, right? It's for the public benefit that we should all vaccinate.
So herd immunity was originally used to describe naturally acquired immunity, which is totally different than vaccine-acquired immunity. Vaccine-acquired immunity is a valid type of immunity, but it is a partial and temporary type of immunity versus the robust and durable body-wide immune response that you have in herd immunity. Part of the vaccine marketing campaign was to co-opt the herd immunity phrase and ascribe it to vaccination. But there are some serious limitations to having vaccine-acquired herd immunity. One, there is a particular portion of the population who was considered a non-responder, which means they will never mount an immune response no matter how many times you vaccinate them. So that's an issue. You can vaccinate 100% of the people, but maybe only 90% will ever have protection no matter how many times you vaccinate them. The other issue is the temporary nature of vaccine-acquired immunity. It is very different clinically than the natural acquired immunity. And when you look at someone who's been vaccinated, there's no way to know if they're actually vaccine protected. And we don't actually do titers on a regular basis to determine how many people in the population still have their vaccine-acquired immunity due to this temporary and partial nature of vaccine-acquired immunity, which is very different than the robust, durable, long-lasting herd immunity that is naturally acquired.
That is very interesting, I think, because I don't know that people necessarily understand. I did not realize before I started really researching this that there is a difference between naturally acquired and vaccine acquired. So That's interesting.
Also worth noting that vaccine-acquired immunity, one of the other pillars that makes it identifiably different is that vaccine-acquired immunity isn't passed on to progeny. Whereas when you get a natural infection, let's say you get the measles and you give birth to a child, that child is going to be born with an immunological benefit that came from you having a durable, robust, body-wide natural infection of measles that you survived and were able to pass on to your progeny. Whereas part of the temporary and partial nature of vaccine-acquired immunity means it does not get passed down to progeny. So that can create an issue generation over generation, depending on which pathway of immunity acquisition you choose to take, natural or vaccine-acquired.
That's a really interesting additional context. So how would the other side argue that this is one of the most important points if we are going to try to advocate for herd immunity when it could either not necessarily last or people aren't really fully protected? What's the other perspective there?
Well, again, not being a public health expert at all, but just being a person trying to make sense of this, what I would come back to is the fact that my mom and dad have scars right here from their smallpox vaccinations. And I don't know anybody who has had smallpox. I don't know anyone who has had polio. I don't know anyone who has had measles. Now, I do know that there have been outbreaks of measles coming back. Well, I haven't heard of an outbreak of polio, so maybe that's an interesting thing for us to get into. But I have heard of the outbreaks of measles, and those have been starting back up since more and more people have been opting out of vaccines. So that's what has me really concerned. And especially, I've heard people say, well, measles isn't that bad, but children do die of measles. And so that's the real question that we're facing, right? And what I want to emphasize is that I know that people on both sides of this are acting out of care and a desire to protect children and people in general. So that's the world I'm looking at. Like, I'm not afraid to go to the swimming pool in the summer the way my parents were as children. Why is that? That's the place I'm coming from.
That's a really valid argument. I've heard that before. That seems to be a common. I agree. I don't see anyone who has smallpox. So how do we respond to that?
So one, it's important to understand the history of vaccines and vaccinology and the evolution of how these products have been created. So smallpox is a very old vaccine that basically they took a live whole cell virus and injected it into another person. And there was a very high adverse event rate and a very high bloom of cases of polio after smallpox that they started doing that, because it was basically giving you a live guaranteed exposure, so much so that they changed the way that we're creating vaccines and moved away from live whole cell derivatives into a live attenuated or a fully killed attenuated version, a weaker version, because the side effects from the whole cell, while very effective at producing sterilizing immunity in those that could sustain the toxicity of the vaccine, it did create a big problem in terms of adverse events. So they did shift the program. And it's important to recognize that the smallpox vaccine, the methods that they created that don't even exist anymore because the safety profile was so disastrous, even though it did provide a sterilizing immunity effect in terms of stopping the suppression. That is true. It came at a cost, and the public health bodies as a group decided that that cost was too high, and they began to shift the vaccine program into a more partially or fully attenuated, which means killed, version of the viruses to try and mitigate that risk. And the downside of that is that we get breakthrough infections. It's more temporary and partial in nature rather than a whole cell reaction. The vaccine of the smallpox era was very, very different than the varicella vaccine of today.
Okay, so I just want to say one thing because I see you taking notes, and I definitely want you guys to just feel free to have this conversation. Like, you don't always have to come to me, but that is such an interesting point because I'm hearing that on the one hand, it seems like vaccines we had a positive, right? That it became safer to get vaccines. Because of the different types.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's great. But then on the other hand, we have a downside that now they're not as effective. Is that okay? Interesting. Sorry, I just want to make sure that I heard that correctly.
Yeah. The original dream of the vaccination program was to have them create what's called sterilizing immunity, which means it stops the transmission and infection of whatever pathogen that you're vaccinating for. But the adverse event rates were so high and the breakthrough infection rates were so high that they moved more into an attenuated, weaker version. But the downfall of that is that most vaccines today create what's called non-sterilizing immunity, which means their intended purpose is to reduce the severity of symptomatology in the recipient alone, but they're not actually designed to prevent transmission or infection to another.
All right.
Feel free.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm trying to learn here. I want to understand what the arguments are because again, I'm trying to make sense of this.
I appreciate you so much, Jessie.
This is fun. This is fun. This is what we need more of, right? Like epistemic humility. That's the thing we talk about all the time in our program, right? Like, oh, I don't know. So, okay, a couple questions that I have. Sure. First of all, we are talking about a mandate here, and I hear you. One thing we agree on, right, is that you are not against vaccination.
No, I am not against vaccination. Yeah, okay. I support an individual's right to choose.
Yeah. Look at me. I'm like, look at what the other side is saying. Like, this is let's make sure we get what we're actually disagreeing about. But the risk assessment, it just strikes me that it's very different now because we haven't had to face the fear of things like smallpox or polio. And so I assume that back then people were rushing for these vaccines because whatever risks there were, whatever risks there were, most people were deciding that it is better to have the immunity if you believe it's going to work. Now maybe they weren't rushing for it. Maybe it was terrifying. Maybe it was like, this is going to make me sick. So I'm thinking this through out there, right? As I talk about this, right? But my understanding from what my parents told me when they were kids is that it was seen as an incredibly miraculous breakthrough that changed the way they spent their summer vacations when that polio vaccine became available. And now, is it just that we weigh that risk differently because we haven't lived through that? And I say that with humility because I do believe like vaccine injuries are real. And so we are asking somebody to carry a risk. And so that's where I'm sitting. That's where I sit with this question of mandates. Because I also know, or at least I'm told, with this herd immunity thing, it doesn't work. Or it doesn't work as well. People will get sick if we don't have a certain rate of vaccination.
How do we know we have a certain rate of vaccination when we're not checking people's titer levels? How do we know how many people are vaccine protected?
Can you just clarify what you mean by the titer level, checking the titer levels?
So vaccine protected means you have a blood antibody test that shows up at a certain level that demonstrates that your body still has a strong immune defense response to a particular pathogen. And without the presence of titers, you are considered unprotected. We don't check titers.
And I don't even know what would that even be a manageable thing that we could do? Is that something, how would we maintain it?
Yeah, we don't check titers right now. And again, we have the responder, non-responder issue to consider also, that certain people, no matter how many times you vaccinate them, will never mount an immune response and demonstrate a positive antibody titer test.
So if we're mandating that they get it over and over, we're just doing it basically for nothing.
I have a friend who was a nurse in California who had 8 varicella vaccines because they're a non-responder before they gave up. She never, ever did mount an immune response.
Did you have anything else? Sure. I mean, okay, so that actually kind of scares me a little bit because now I'm like, well, crap, am I a non-responder? Am I going to get measles if not enough people are vaccinated with the MMR vaccine? Because that is a thing that I'm seeing bubble up in various communities. And so then you see, like I tried to do some research, so I didn't come in here like totally not knowing what I'm talking to. I've talked to a lot of doctors and we've debated this sort of thing. The idea that mandates get voted in when there's a measles outbreak. Because I mean, and I really respect that because I think that people, I mean, I respect what you say about a fear mechanism because fear motivates people. But is this fear not legitimate?
I think As we look especially at measles, measles is a great example, and I'm so glad that you brought it up. One, because the measles component of the MMR does produce a good, strong sterilizing immunity effect. Not so much the mumps or the rubella portion, but the measles portion does have good epidemiological benefit that shows that it does prevent the transmission and infection of measles. But as we look at measles as a whole, the thing to consider that's different is that people who were born 1965 and earlier, they're not given a measles vaccine because everybody born before then is assumed to have had measles because it is such an infectious disease. And as those people are dying off, all we have left are the people like me who were vaccinated for it, whose vaccine-acquired immunity has worn off long ago. And so we've been living in this world where we're under this hypothetical threshold of threat for decades, and yet we've had pretty stable, incidences. We've had a few outbreaks of things, but we have outbreaks of infectious disease all the time for things that we don't vaccinate for. So I think with measles in particular, driving some of the outbreaks that you see is people who's maybe thought they were protected because they got the vaccines however long ago, but they weren't aware because they weren't told of the partial and temporary nature of vaccine-acquired immunity. And so they're going around with a false sense of security when really they either need to find some way to protect themselves from the measles virus, whether that be a vaccine, whether that be home prophylaxis, whether that be supplementation, but they are at risk and they don't know it.
So I'm curious too. You made a comment about, could I catch it from someone if I have not mounted an immunity? That's a great question. But what I understand, though, it sounds like you were saying that not all vaccines actually prevent transmission.
Yes, many of them are designed to just reduce symptomatology in the recipient alone. They're not designed to prevent spread or transmission.
So that to me sounds like, would it even matter? Is just if your concern is, there's these people who they didn't get vaccinated, but if the vaccine is not intended to prevent transmission, is that fear founded? Does that fear have any grounding? Does that make sense?
The fear of getting infected by someone who's not vaccinated. Well, I mean, again, someone who isn't vaccinated doesn't have that disease. And if they had that disease, they would be symptomatic and more likely to be cloistered and not circulating in society. The greater risk for a vaccine that produces non-sterilizing immunity, meaning it doesn't prevent transmission or infection, it's only designed to reduce the symptomatology in the recipient alone, is that it can create an asymptomatic spreader situation where, like, pertussis is a great example of this, okay? The pertussis component of the DTaP and the Tdap is not at all designed to prevent transmission or infection of the pertussis bacteria at all. It is designed to reduce symptomatology in the recipient. There are lots and lots of evidence-based articles, and all of them on the CDC and are well aware and well, read, that it colonizes in the throat up to 3 to 6 weeks post-vaccination, depending on your own individual makeup. And so let's say you get this vaccine to protect your grandchild from pertussis, because that's what they tell you to do. They had all of those commercials with the grandmother wolf, breathing on the baby. But the reality is that person goes and gets a vaccine thinking they're protecting others, but all it does is reduce symptomatology in themselves. After they receive that vaccine, they become a carrier because they've been exposed directly through intramuscular injection with the pertussis infection itself. And so it's colonizing in their body without symptomatology being expressed. So that new recipient doesn't know, because they aren't fully informed on the risk of being a recipient of a non-sterilizing vaccine. And so they go and engage in society as normal, including breathing and kissing on a new baby who would indeed be very vulnerable to pertussis, whooping cough, right? And so this lack of awareness and this lack of honesty about what it means when it's a sterilizing versus non-sterilizing. There's certainly many reasons why you want to protect yourself from pertussis, and I am not here in any way to tell you that vaccination isn't one of the ways you can do that as an individual. But the reality is it causes colonization in your throat and upper respiratory mucosa. You cough, sneeze, clear your throat. Those bacterial droplets get spread around and they infect other people because you have injected that into your body.
And you don't realize that you're spreading it.
No, because you were not told through informed consent what that means.
Which is a whole nother thing for sure. So I'm curious, did you have that knowledge, and not necessarily looking as a medical professional, just as one of us people? Were you aware of the differences in vaccination types?
No, I wasn't. And I do think that one of the things I find most sympathetic about my esteemed opponent's side is that there's a request to just let us know things. Yeah. Don't coerce us, tell us what the risks are, don't hide these things. And I really sympathize with that argument. I do believe that vaccines are good, and most people, upwards of 99% of people should choose to get them, and the exceptions that were carved out in law should exist because we need them. But for everyone else, don't be afraid of the vaccines. To me, we talked about fear, right? Like, I still am. I don't think it's just fear mongering. I really am afraid of getting measles, or even worse, polio. I think we should be afraid of that. I think that's a healthy fear. Fear is adaptive in some cases. You just want to make sure that it's in line with reality. But don't condescend to us, right? Like, tell us what we need to know. The warnings that, the state of California, I don't live in California, the state of California requires us to tell you that this plastic causes birth defects, and I'm afraid to use the plastic now. So if that could make people trust vaccines, I'm all for that. Like, let's talk about what the risks are so people don't feel like there's some sort of, conspiracy to force this on people. Like, there's a risk in everything in the world. So I just wonder what do you think, Carrie? Like, is there a level at which, if you were informed of these certain things, like, what would you need to be informed of to say, hey, this is enough? We can trust these vaccines, and to even, dare I say, because I know you're for choice, you're for letting other people. Is there anything that you could be done to make you trust this system enough that you would even be pro-vaccine?
Yeah, I mean, one, I would love to see liability restored to manufacturers and administrators, as I think that would create an incentivization process that would result in a safer and more effective product. With regard to your fear, in terms of fear of illness, that's a very valid thing. And I'm not here to tell someone how to protect themselves from infectious disease. That is a concern. I would like to point out that we vaccinate for a handful of infectious diseases, maybe 2 handfuls, where it's like 14 actual infectious diseases plus a bacterial infection in the name of tetanus. But there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of other infectious diseases. But we've been trained to focus, to be afraid of the things for which there is a vaccine, rather than looking at a holistic approach of overall infectious disease prevention. Things like good diet, good sunlight, lots of movement, healthy supplementation to optimize your, gut microbiome, where 70% of your immune system lives. I mean, we don't talk about that way to mitigate risk. There are many ways to protect yourself from infectious disease. Vaccination is definitely one of them, but it's not the only way, or depending on your individual health history, maybe not the best way.
So what I'm hearing, though, and this is an interesting point, because I think this is right. We have a loss of trust in, like, why should I listen to the government? I can't trust you at all. So how do I know that what you're actually telling me when you're mandating this, that you have my best interests at heart? So that, in which you're saying, great point, that there's no liability there.
Yeah, and they're also legally not required to disclose any risk of harms. I happen to have here, just for divine providence purposes, really, I have a copy of a CDC document. Where is it? Right in here somewhere. There it is. You can see right here. Let me open this up, pull it out. This is directly from the CDC document called Vaccine Information Statement, the History of the Vaccine Information Statement. It is a table where you can see when the NCVIA was passed in 1986, you can see these 10 robust points of required informed consent. Okay. They had to tell you all kinds of things, including alternatives, the risk that happened in the trials. They had to disclose precautionary measures that legal representatives should take to reduce the risk of any major adverse reactions, early warning signs or symptoms to which representatives should be alert as possible precursors to major adverse event reactions in some. And then in 1993, they took away 60% of your right to informed consent as a vaccine recipient. And then in 2016, they reduced it even further down to 2 points to where legally for any childhood vaccine on the schedule, of which all of the vaccines recommended today are on the childhood schedule because of this NCVIA protection, they only legally have to provide you with a website address somewhere in the appointment notes, alerting you to the existence of the NCVIA and the existence of VAERS. VAERS is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, and the NCVIA is the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. You can find this document at cdc.gov, enter into the search bar history of the vaccine information sheet, and a long document describing the very sordid tale of your loss of informed consent rights is there. But this table is also there too, pulled directly from the CDC. So when you talk about lack of trust, they have passed literal federal laws about not telling me what the risk is. And as an advocate, I have sat in bill hearings. One in particular was a wonderful consumer rights bill in Colorado. It was HB, I think, 1383. I can't remember the exact bill number now. There's so many bill numbers. But it was an informed consent bill, and it was a vaccine consumer rights bill. And we were there advocating for the bill, providing people with robust informed consent prior to vaccination that was more in alignment with the 1986 rules. And all of the other side was testifying that if we provide informed consent at this level to recipients, too many people will say no and the program will crumble. Therefore, we cannot pass this informed consent consumer rights bill.
So I'm going to step in, kind of playing devil's advocate a little bit with Jessie here because I'm curious. Because I always like to take a step back and try to be objective. And I can see an argument that people might say, well, it's not, sometimes there are people that know better, right? So let's apply it to Moms for Liberty. As moms, we generally assume we know better than our small children. We know that it's better for you to not eat just ice cream and chocolate cake. We know that, and we're going to enforce that whether or not you as a child want that. So I know it's a very simplified, clearly example of it, but again, this is just from that perspective. If they see, these doctors are saying, the medical boards, et cetera, are saying this is important, you need to do it, and you, if we tell you all these things, you might know just enough, because there is that fallacy. I forget what that law is. There's like a rule that when you know just enough, then you think you are like an expert, and in reality, you aren't. And I can't think of the name of it, but it's very interesting.
Dunning-Kruger.
Yes. And that's a real thing. So people will think that they know better and actually put themselves at risk when they ought to be doing something that the experts know. So there's the argument.
My response to that is if they're so safe and so effective and they know so much better for us, they should own the liability.
I'm curious. Add anything you like?
I can't disagree with that, actually. Those, I think, are some of the most compelling arguments. I don't know the facts, right? So I'm listening to some doctors who might argue that. I don't know. I can't refute that. But if that is true, and you are also a sincere person who cares about people, so I'm ready to believe that, because I know there are malevolent actors out there. There are people who just want to coerce us because they don't trust us. And that, to those on my side, I would say that I think is the greatest threat to this project of vaccination that I believe has radically transformed public health in our country. And so I cede that readily. If that is not, if we feel like things are being hidden from us, I'm going to come over to your side and say, hold on a second, right?
It's not even a feeling that they're being hidden. It's that actual federal laws have been passed and amended to restrict your ability as a vaccine recipient to even be made aware of the risks inherent in the vaccination program.
And I didn't mean to say feeling. I take that back.
And the recipient owns 100% of the legal, physical, and financial risk. And if they're not told the scope of that risk, how can anyone in good conscience accept the risk that they haven't qualified, right? That they haven't explained to them. So all they're being told is that they're safe and effective.
So if we took out that,
I think if we restored liability, our entire vaccine program would dramatically change in a very short period of time for the positive in terms of safety and efficacy for the recipients. Before the NCVIA was enacted in 1986, the vaccine manufacturers were a very small portion of pharmaceutical business in general. They were facing extreme legal losses due to injuries from the DTP vaccine, which was the precursor to the DTaP-Tdap combination. It was the whole cell diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine that they stopped making because of how many injuries were happening. And all of these pharmaceutical manufacturers lobbied Reagan and lobbied Congress saying, hey, we are losing it in court due to all these injuries. We're going to stop making vaccines unless you can give us complete liability protection. And if they were to restore liability again, I think we would see a dramatic shift in the ways in which vaccines are manufactured, administered, and discussed by public health authorities. You can see it now with the interim period of revocation of the EUA for the COVID vaccines. A lot of pharmacies now are requiring a doctor's note or a prescription. They're no longer willing to just carte blanche vaccinate because there is a gray area of liability. And so all of a sudden, you need a reason.
That's interesting. And what are your...
Yeah. Okay. So I'm definitely coming up with questions that now I want to go ask a lot of different people, because I trust a lot of different people with different views on this about liability, right? Like, is there any defensible argument for like frivolous lawsuits or things that really weren't caused by vaccines? And we know that there's a defensible argument. Like, those are all interesting questions. I cannot answer them. And yet I'm very sympathetic to this. Like, if maybe we could just solve this right here, right now on this Mom for Liberty panel, we come up with this, we're going to hold people liable. We're going to prove that we believe in these vaccines. That would be great. I'm 100% for that. Again, I'd like to ask the questions like, what am I missing? But here's what I'm afraid of, that the very understandable anger at these institutions, the erosion of trust, which makes total sense to me. I have also lost trust in them. This is not me trying to condescend about that, right? Like, I'm there on a lot of issues with professional organizations caving to activists, making unwise decisions. Like, I also am skeptical of a lot of these things. So even when I'm not skeptical of this, I can see why someone would be. Here's what I'm afraid of. What if we're talking about fears. What if the concerns about vaccines go so far that the Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., there's a petition out there for him, and I believe he supports this, to ban the polio vaccine. I'm not for that. I don't want polio coming back. I like going to the swimming pool in the summer. So that scares me. So how do we get that? How do we deal with trust? How do we get the right protections out there so that trust in the system is preserved?
So going back to your earlier point of not understanding the lawsuits that brought about the changes to the informed consent laws, I would redirect you back to cdc.gov, to that history of the vaccine information sheet. I had a table that was excerpted from there, but it's a multi-page document that goes back to the early 70s to one of the groundbreaking lawsuits, which was Reyes versus Wyeth Laboratories, in which a catastrophic injury happened after a DTP vaccine that was not fully disclosed, even though there were known risks. And that started the process of requiring informed consent. And you can see there that those injuries happened, and you can read the story from the government's perspective because it's a government-generated document, and you can learn about how they came to these conclusions of changing your informed consent right. And in terms of, one, I would love to see your source about RFK taking away polio, because
I think it was hypothetical.
Okay, because he's not an anti-vaccine man. He has no intention, as far as anything I've ever seen, of him banning vaccines. I think there is a possibility that he could change the safety testing requirements for vaccinations. Like, he's already shifted that some by requiring an inert placebo, which has never been done before for any vaccine on the schedule. And he's also indicated that he's going to make moves to have the vaccine safety protocols for trials mirror those of pharmaceutical drugs. Right now, there's a huge disconnect between being a biologic trial and being a pharmaceutical drug trial that doesn't benefit the recipient. But I think through those processes of increased liability and increased safety and efficacy requirements, that there may be some vaccines that won't meet those standards. And we'll have to deal with the emotional fallout from that. And maybe a new system of homeoprophylaxis, or maybe some of his MAHA initiatives of overall health improvements and immune system optimization will come in to fill in the void. But I don't see him banning it, but I definitely do see him making those standards more in alignment with other pharmaceutical products, and that maybe some of those vaccines won't meet those standards.
I think you make a good point, though, here. So both of you do, because what I'm hearing, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is there's concern on the pro-vaccine side that people's lack of understanding is going to go so far to the extreme that it's that whole pendulum swing that now we're ending up doing ourselves harm, which hopefully it won't go to that extreme. You're saying because we believe that the person in charge is not actually too crazy.
There's definitely a potentiality of people going too far and not trusting in public health. But again, the public health authorities deserved this reputation in this shift because they were so egregiously dishonest during the pandemic times, and they were discovered even before then to be dishonest about a lot of things regarding public health. There does need to be some type of trust restored, but I don't have an easy solution other than having wonderful, loving, connected conversations with people to try and build bridges where common ground can be found. And there's so much common ground to be found.
And I do think we've gotten there. We're running short on time, so I want to get us close to wrap up. Although I will say, bummed on that because there was a particular statement you just made about us being litigious, and I was prepping for this as well, and that was a thought that I had, an argument of why the liability was taken away, because frankly, America's a little bit of a litigious country.
Yes.
And so I could see that being a real concern. Are we putting the public health, like now, if these companies won't ever manufacture anything because of ambulance chasing lawyers, which there's plenty of now, they're going to bring a lawsuit for absolutely no reason. How do we separate those and end up with a true situation?
So for that, I would direct to pharmaceutical drugs, okay? Where pharmaceutical drugs have liability. There are recalls for pharmaceutical drugs every single year. Every single pharmaceutical manufacturer has been convicted of criminal crimes for fraud, racketeering, falsification of safety data on things they have liability for, right? So that's something there. And when you have a trial where you're trying to prove causation, you have a process of discovery, right? In that process of discovery, you're able to get lots of information from the other side to determine what they knew and when they knew it, and how much they actually disclosed it honestly to you, the patient. And you can see like examples with like the Johnson & Johnson baby powder. They knew for 4 decades that there was lead in the baby powder, and that was causing problems. And they hid it. Why did they hide it? Because they could. How did we find out? Through legal liability and discovery. And so any claimant is going to have to prove through the judiciary system causative effect through the process of discovery. So litigious false claims in medical stuff isn't so much a thing as like, oh, I slipped on a banana peel I put there myself, and now I'm suing your homeowner's insurance.
Okay, that's a great
a much higher bar. And so when you look at pharmaceutical drugs, there aren't a lot of frivolous litigation regarding harm. And even with pharmaceutical drugs, it is a hard road for an injured person to prove causation in the judiciary.
Okay, so that's an excellent point. We are right at time. So I do want to give you each a chance to say a quick closing statement, and then thank you. And where people can find you.
Sure. I think I feel like I've learned something that's going to keep me learning about this discussion and just how to have better conversations about public health when there's not always experts around. There's an expert on one side who disagrees with an expert on another side. And how do we as Americans make sense of this when we don't know? We didn't even get into questions of expertise, which we could go on and on about. There's so much we could say. But yeah, so my closing statement is I see a tension here that I want us to think about very carefully. It's that freedom versus interdependence and the assessment of risk. And how do we as a healthy society respect people weighing those two competing goods? Freedom to do what we think is right for ourselves, but also the fact that our choices necessarily impact others, which is the core question of this issue. And I believe this first step is to at least talk to each other about it. That's what we do at Braver Angels. I'm going to be up in Philadelphia as we record this. It will be tomorrow, but it will be on YouTube by the time. I think both of these events will go on YouTube. There's an epidemiologist from Temple University, Dr. Maciek Boni, talking to David Zweig with our facilitator, Wilk Wilkinson, who is friends with both Francis Collins and Jay Bhattacharya. So we're really interested in this with our Truth and Trust project. We really want to hear from people, vaccine injured, people who believe their children died because of other people's lack of vaccines. These are all real things that people are experiencing in this country. And I'm grateful to anyone who's willing to have a conversation about it.
I agree.
At Texans for Vaccine Choice, we fight for three main things, tirelessly, without ceasing. We fight for your right to informed consent, your right to understand why you want to say yes or why you want to say no. We fight for your right to have a choice to say yes or no, free of government coercion. And then above all, we fight for your right to medical privacy. Whatever choice you make, I want that choice to be private and not up for public display or discussion. During the pandemic, we saw a breach of all of that. No informed consent, completely blank inserts. We saw silence and fear of people not being able to connect and talk about it. We saw having to show your vaccine status, your personal private medical information to go to Walmart or get a job or leave the house to get groceries. Huge, egregious overreaches by the state, which is why mandates are so bad for society, period. And outreach, I agree with Jessie. I could not agree anymore. The importance of having the conversation. At TFVC, we spend so much time teaching our advocates ways to have this discussion in a loving and productive and connective way. And outreach is a skill. It's a skill that you're not born with, but you can learn. And if you want to learn more about how to have loving, connected, and productive conversations about a tricky topic like this, you can learn more at texansforvaccinechoice.com. I am always happy to help, no matter what state you live in, no matter what situation you have, to help you reach out with love and talk to someone else about this.
Well, thank you both ladies very much. I really appreciate you coming and modeling what it's like to have a conversation either with an expert or with someone who might know more, but hey, you still have questions, because we're allowed, even if we're not medical experts, we're allowed to have these questions. And
he can read.
We can read. We can watch YouTube. Although some things on there are questionable. But in any case, thank you very much. I hope you found this educational and you feel equipped to be able to go and ask some questions yourself and start that conversation, because that's really our goal here, is to build engaged citizens, not enraged activists, of course. And as is famously said by James Madison, the advancement and diffusion of knowledge is the only true guardian of liberty, which is, of course, the mission of M4L Academy. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.